right, hello again, everybody. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Neil Noddings and care ethics. So, if we look at our chart of our moral theories, we'll see that we will be looking at interpersonal ethics with a primary focus on relationships, right? So, Noddings is a care ethicist, meaning that she is interested in looking at the needs of people, right? And the relationships that they stand in with one another, and then evaluating how we ought to respond to one another's needs, right? And emotions and relationships and what we think about one another can have a genuine spotlight in ethics, right? So the idea is that we can be somewhat partial to the people that we love, like over and above people that we don't know, to strangers, right? We owe certain things to people who are in our proximity over and above what we may owe to a stranger, say. So, anyway, the idea here is we're going to be looking at the relationships, not just things about the person, right? But rather how the person stands in relation to other people. Okay. So, care ethics. Um, so, deontology and consequentialism are impartial moral theories, right? So, according to consequentialism, we got to consider the best outcome for the greatest number of people. Okay. According to deontology, we have to respect the autonomy of other people all the time, right? There's a rule, and we have got to follow that rule and treat everybody the same, right? In consequentialism, we're looking at the greatest outcome or the greatest pleasure, right, for the greatest number of people. Okay, so suppose that you're on a boat and your spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend, right, your partner falls off the one side and two people fall off on the other side of the boat. Okay, so there's one person and there's two people. If you're a consequentialist, you're going to say that you probably ought to save those two strangers over and above your partner, right? Or suppose that it's one stranger, right? We might say that you ought to deliberate a little bit, think about it a little bit. Um, so you have your partner, you could save that person, or you could save a stranger. Consequentialism and deontology says that we ought to treat this in our moral reasoning in kind of a cold and sterile way, right? Just because somebody's your partner is not a good reason to prefer saving them over some other person, right? And for a lot of people hesitate at this, and they say, "Well, no, it seems to be relevant that the person on the one side of a boat is our partner, and the other person is a stranger." So how is it that we can fit? Um, how is it that we can fit kind of our feelings, and how can we fit our relationships, right? Um, into our moral reasoning. And this is where care ethics is going to offer us some guidance, right? Um, so the traditional approach to ethics does seem to have what we might call an impartial view on everybody, right? Whereas care ethics has a partial view on everyone. I owe certain things to my partner that I don't necessarily owe to a stranger, right? Whereas according to consequentialism, according to deontology, like I owe them the very same thing, right? And so care ethics can sort of, adjust better to various circumstances and to our emotions than these other ones, right? So we'll see that as a strength of this view. Okay, so consider the Heinz dilemma. Okay, so this is from Lawrence Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg is famously claimed that there is a hierarchy of moral development, right? And so the idea is that The lowest form of moral development is fear of punishment, right? Whereas the highest form of moral development is like acting on abstract personal principles, or acting on moral principles in general, right? Okay, so here I'm not going to read this case, but you can. The idea here is that, okay, we have Heinz. Heinz's wife is very, very sick. Okay, and he goes to the druggist with $1,000, and this druggist has created a new drug that will potentially save his wife. The druggist has spent $200 making each individual dose, but wants $2,000 for every dose. And so Heinz comes and he says, "Look, I have $1,000. I'll give you the $1,000. I'll give you the other $1,000 if you just give me the dose now." And the other guy, the apothecary or the druggist, says, "No, no, no, no. I want the $2,000. I'm going to get rich on this. I'm going to do this, like blah blah blah." And so what Heinz does, um, is that he goes and he steals the drug for his wife. And the question is, should Heinz have stolen the drug? Okay, so um, Kohlberg, he had people come and look at this case, analyze this case, offer reasons for what they thought. And what ended up happening is that more men said that he should not have stolen the drug because stealing is just wrong, right? And more women said that it was okay that he stole the drug because he had a good reason for stealing it, namely because his wife needed it, right? And so Kohlberg concluded that like men are morally more developed than women, and it was this kind of weird conclusion that women like tend to think more with their emotions, and men tend to think more abstractly about like principles and stuff. And so that means that on his hierarchy of moral development, um, uh, men tend to rank higher than women. So Kohlberg had a graduate student who was like really skeptical of this data, and anyway published some responses in response to this. And so this is kind of like the seed of, or some of the seeds of, care ethics, right? So the idea here is that, look, like we can make sense of this case using our emotions as well as abstract principles too, right? The women who were polled, right, in this case, they have something to bring to our moral table as well, right? So um, so this is kind of like the origins of care ethics. So we might think of two different like broad modes of moral thinking. One is the ethics of justice, right? And so this is the idea everybody's equal. We owe everybody the same things. We ought to be impartial, right? We ought to treat one person the same way that we treat another person, that we same way we treat some other person, right? And it tends to say that, look, we have these moral principles, bring about the best outcomes, act with good character, act in such a way as to treat somebody as an end in themselves, right? Deontology. And those abstract principles apply to particular cases, right? Whereas with care ethics, tends to be a little bit more bottom up approach, right? So it's rooted in how we respond to one another's needs, right? I have various needs. You have various needs. We stand in relations with other people who can help us meet those needs. So our parents will help us meet our needs in a special way that really kind of nobody else can, right? Our spouses, our partners, help meet our needs in many different ways, in ways that are helpful, and only they can do that for us. um, Ethics of care, it tends to be um, more tied together with your emotions, right? You feel certain things, and you respond based, like that's your reason for responding, is because your partner or the person that you stand in a relationship with needs that thing, right? So this is often a more bottom-up approach, right? We kind of learn what we ought to do, not by some abstract principle, but rather uh, the things that are around us give us reasons for acting, right? Okay. So, I mean, so one thing, like, here's an example. Before we keep going, here's an example: is you and I stand in a relationship with one another. If you're my student and I'm your instructor, right? That means that you and I are in a relation with one another, a student-teacher relation with one another. That means that you have various needs, right? You need to do well in this course. You need to complete the course. You need to complete the assignments. You need to learn the material. And I'm here to, and I can respond to those needs, right? Because I stand in this very special position as your instructor, right? So, and I have various needs too, you know, and so qua teacher, I have various needs, and that me and we, so we respond to one another's needs, right? So anyway, this is one example of how care ethics can sort of fit into different kinds of relationships, right? So it's not just family relationships, it's not just spousal relationships. Care ethics sort of looks at any kind of relationship, every kind of relationship, and says, look, people need to respond in these ways based on these needs. Um, so this is very briefly the role of the masculine and feminine in care ethics. So care ethics does tend to be very feminine in broadly in terms of being emotional and things like this. This is what Noddings thinks. So the idea is that it's a masculine trait or a masculine characteristic to look at abstract principles and apply those abstract principles in this very logical and regimented way. And then it's a very feminine characteristic to kind of feel what it is that you ought to do, right? If you love your spouse, you're going to steal for your spouse, right? Whereas if you think that stealing is wrong every single time, then you're going to um, steal, right? Going to steal. So or you're not going to steal because of this abstract uh, principle. So anyway, so this is this feminine approach to ethics. Okay, so care ethics has uh, five really interesting characteristics. Um, so first of all, and we've already been talking about that, right? We look at the needs of people that we have some relationship to, right? So our mothers and fathers need certain things from us, right? We need various things from our mothers and fathers, right? And that means that we reciprocate, right? And the reason why we reciprocate, this gets into number two, is because we love one another, right? Is because we feel strong things towards one another, right? And that can those emotions can help give us reasons for our actions, right? They can be guiding in some relevant way. So emotions are not to be rejected as they are, say, in consequentialism or in deontology, right? Kant doesn't care how you feel. Mill doesn't care how you feel. They care about outcomes. They care about the rules, right? Regardless of your feelings. And so in care ethics, what we can have this sort of emotional sphere around us. We can use our emotions to generate reasons for our actions. Um, so it engages in particular contexts and respects the bonds of them rather than engaging in abstraction as an attempt to remove biases and foster impartiality. So, what does that mean? That means that we're looking at particular relationships. We're looking at here are two people, right? A wife and a husband that love one another very much. And we are we are looking at their relationship and what they owe to one another. We're not saying what all husbands and all wives owe to their spouses, right? We're just looking at these two people and we're making ethical deliberations based on their particular context. Um, it reconceptualizes the public-private distinction of a more traditional moral theory. So the idea is that um, what we owe to one another, right? We're not talking about a public principle that's like all wives and all husbands owe this to their spouses. Uh, Rather, we're saying, look, this is what these two people owe to one another. This is what she needs. This is what you can give her. This is what he needs. This is what you can give her, or whatever. And then the last part is understands person in a relational sense instead of wholly independent, right? As recognized by other Enlightenment moral theories. So let's talk a little bit more about this fifth characteristic. Um, we can think about how we understand ourselves, right? So the idea here is that in deontology, um, inconsequentialism, we isolate ourselves from our other relationships, right? We look at ourselves and we say, look, I am Spencer Atkins. Doesn't matter where I am, who I'm around, I'm always going to be me, right? I'm always going to be me, regardless of any of my features that I may lose, regardless of any of the relationships that I am engaged in or may lose. I am essentially independent from everybody else. Okay. And then there's this Eastern or Buddhist conception of no self, right? The idea is that there is no you. You're just part of the larger scheme of things. And so essentially you are nothing, right? But then lastly, there's this relational conception of yourself. And the idea is that look, you are you, but who you are is based on the relationships that you have with other people, right? So um, I have a relationship with my grandmother. I love my grandmother very much. Um, I am who I am in part because I love my grandmother and stand in a relationship with my grandmother, right? The grandparent, grandchild relation. And that helps make me who I am. And that helps make her who she is. And if we're ever separated, right, I'm going to lose parts of myself that she drew out, and she's going to lose parts of herself that I drew out, right? So the idea is that, look, we become who we are based on the people that we are around, right? And so who we are is not isolated from everybody. Rather, who we are is deeply entrenched in the other relationships that we hold and have, right? And so this is the conception of what a self is that the care ethicist is going to be working with, right? Okay. So what does it mean to care? Um, so we need to think about the one that's doing the caring and the one that's being cared for, right? So the one that's being cared for has a need, right? And the one caring has something to give to the other person, right? Um, so, so the idea here is that uh, we have to stand in a special relationship with one another in order to respond to one another this way. So if I'm like walking down the street and I see a stranger, and the stranger is like, I sure would love to have a boat, you know, or a new car. Uh, I don't have to give them that. They may need that. There may be something that they desire or something that they want, right? But I'm in no way obligated to give them that thing, right? Or even like I don't know if it's a stranger and they say, "Oh, I really need a hug," like I'm not obligated to give them that. Whereas I might be obligated to give that to say my spouse, right? Because I stand in a special relation with them, and if they need a hug, like I'm the hugger, right? I'm the like the spouse, right? The person that loves this other person. And so that puts me in a special relation to the one that's being cared for, right? So um, the one caring and the one cared for is going to look a little bit different based on the relationship. Now, an example of a stranger, a stranger relation, right? I have a need not to be killed, right? And the stranger also has a need not to be killed. And so one thing is we refrain from killing one another, right? I can care for another person by not killing them, and another person can care for me by not killing me, right? So so we can care for strangers, right? We just the care looks a little bit different too, right? Or if a stranger asks me for help, say changing their tire, if it's like a little old lady, I'm like, oh, I can help you change your tire. That's a kind of caring too, right? A stranger caring that goes beyond just say not killing one another. So, um, so care is also about having the right kinds of attitudes and intentions, right? So when we care, we are acting from a place of like emotion, right? And we're acting from like a place of just like wanting to help. And that's like our reason for action. And so let's imagine that like Heinz steals the drug and the wife says something like, "Oh, thanks for stealing the drug. Why did you do it?" If his reason were to be like, "Well, I have a moral obligation and there's this principle that all husbands ought to love their wives and so I stole the drug for you." That's not care, right? The idea is that if he were caring, he would say like the reason why I stole the drug is because I love you, right? And it's because like I want to see you better, and it hurts me to see you like sick like this. Um, that's care, right? So care is in some way, a little bit removed from like abstract principles. We're looking at how things make us feel and like what our actual intention is, and that will make a certain action caring or not. Um, so we look at the one caring, we look at the emotional disposition of the one that's doing the caring, and we determine whether or not there's care going on. And so, um, and so there is this kind of particularity of the cared for's needs, right? So it's also based on the it's also based on the person that's doing the caring, what their emotions, their intentions are, their attitudes, their reasons, like these sorts of things. But it's also has to do with like the cared for. And that's how we get kind of the particularity of this whole thing. So we might wonder, suppose my spouse tells me something like, "Oh, I just have to have the blue monkey diamond. Will you go to France and steal it for me?" Um, and that's like, I don't know, that's like a super like bazillion dollar diamond. Is that suppose that my spouse needs me to do that for her? That seems odd. It seems odd to say that in order to care for her, I have to go steal the diamond. So we got to have some kind of like limitation on the needs, right? Needs have to be in some way regulated, right? We're not obligated, according to care ethics, to be like Santa Claus for one another. That's not what this is about, right? Rather, this is like responding to one another's like reasonable needs. So that might be, if we were going to push back on this theory, we might ask like to flesh out this a little bit more. Or as the theory stands now, I would then be obligated to go steal the blue monkey diamond. Uh, so we can think of responses to that objection. So, but yeah, so the potential problem, are there limits to care? Or does caring we mean that we have to meet every single desire of another person, right? It doesn't seem to mean that. But then we would further ask, well, what are the boundaries of care then? Okay, and then as we've kind of already said, um, there are lots of different relationships, right? There's a relationship between a parent and a child, between a grandparent and a grandchild, right? A relation between an instructor and a student, a relationship between a police officer and his or her constituents, right? Um, Not constituents, right? But the people that the person is around, their district or their scope of authority or whatever. Um, there's all of these different kinds of relationships, right? And that means that there are all kinds of different areas of needs that we have, and we fulfill one another's like area of needs. Um, and that's like, and so our obligations, right, if we can call them that, our obligations to care will be tailored by the relationship that we stand in one another. So if you're my student, I'm going to grade your papers, right? But I'm not going to hug you, like I just won't. Maybe one day if we become friends, but then we're not a teacher student, right? We are we stand in a friendship relation, and so care looks different. So the idea is that like care is going to be sort of uh, in some way changed based on the relationship that we're looking at. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed Care Ethics. Email me if you have questions. And tomorrow or whenever our next class is, we're going to be talking about institutional ethics.